History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8, The Latest Age. Chapter 2, A New World Order. Asian Revolution. The new Constitution of 1950 did nothing to change these facts, some of which would not begin to exercise their full weight until at least the second decade of the new India's existence. Even today, much of life in rural India still goes on virtually as it did in the past, when war, natural disaster, and the banditry of the powerful allowed it to do so. This implies gross poverty for some. In 1960, over a third of the rural poor was still living on less than $1 a week, and at the same time, half of the urban population earned less than enough to maintain the accepted minimum daily calorie intake required for health. Economic progress was followed by population growth. In the circumstances, it is hardly surprising that the rulers of India should have incorporated in the constitution provisions for emergency powers as drastic as any ever enjoyed by a British viceroy, providing, as they did, for preventative detention and the suspension of the individual rights, to say nothing of the suspension of state government and the submission of states to union control under what was called President's rule. The weaknesses and uneasiness of a new nation made things worse when India quarreled with its neighbor, Pakistan, over Kashmir, where a Hindu prince ruled a majority of Muslim subjects. Fighting began there as early as 1947, when the Muslims tried to bring about union with Pakistan. The Maharaja asked for Indian help and joined the Indian Republic. To complicate things further, the Muslim spokesmen of Kashmir were themselves divided. India refused to hold the plebiscite recommended by the United Nations Security Council. Two-thirds of Kashmir then remained in Indian hands as a running sore in Indo-Pakistan relations. Fighting stopped in 1949 only to break out again in 1965-66 and 1969-70. The issue had by then been further complicated by demarcation disputes and quarrels over the use of the Indus waters. In 1971, there was more fighting between the two states when East Pakistan, a Muslim but Bengali-speaking region, broke away to form a new state, Bangladesh, under Indian patronage, thus showing that Islam alone was not enough to constitute a viable state. It soon faced economic problems even worse than those of India or Pakistan. In these troubled passages, India's leaders showed great ambitions, perhaps going at times so far as a wish to reunite the subcontinent, and sometimes blatant disregard of the interests of other peoples, such as the Nagas. The irritation aroused by Indian aspirations was moreover further complicated by the Cold War. India's leader Nehru had quickly insisted that India would not take sides. In 1950s, this meant that India had warmer relations with the USSR and Communist China than with the United States. Indeed, Nehru appeared to relish opportunities of criticizing American action, which helped to convince some sympathizers of India's credentials as a progressive, peaceful, non-aligned democracy. It came as all the greater a shock, therefore, to them and to the Indian Republic to learn in 1959 that Nehru's government had been quarreling with the Chinese about the northern borders for the previous 3 years without saying so. At the end of 1962, large-scale fighting began. Nehru took the improbable step of asking the Americans for military aid and even more improbably received it at the same time when he also took assistance in the form of aeroplane engines from Russia. His prestige at its height in the mid 1950s was seriously diminished. Logically, the young Pakistan had not courted the same friends as India. In 1947, the country was much weaker than its neighbor. With only a tiny trained civil service, Hindus had joined the old Indian civil service in much larger numbers than Muslims. Divided geographically in two from the start, and almost at once had lost its ablest leader, Jinnah. Even under the Raj, Muslim leaders had always, perhaps realistically, shown less confidence in democratic forms than Congress. Usually, Pakistan has been ruled by authoritarian soldiers who have sought to ensure military survival against India, economic development, including land reform and the safeguarding of Islamic ways. It always helped to distance Pakistan from India that she was formally Muslim while her neighbor was constitutionally secular and non confessional. At first sight, a seemingly Western stance, but one not hard to reconcile with Indians' syncretic cultural tradition. This was to lead Pakistan towards increasing Islamic regulation in its internal affairs. Religious difference, though, was to affect Pakistan's foreign relations less than the Cold War. Bandung. The Cold War brought further confusion to Asian politics when an association of professedly neutralist or non aligned nations emerged after a meeting of representatives of 29 African and Asian states at Bandung in Indonesia in 1955. Most delegations, other than China's, were from lands that had been a part of colonial empires. From Europe, they were soon to be joined by Yugoslavia, a country with its own histories of imperial and alien rule to rake over. Most of these nations were also poor and needy, more suspicious of the United States than of Russia, and more attracted to China than to either. They came to be called the Third World Nations, a term apparently coined by a French journalist in a conscious reminiscence of the legally underprivileged French Third State of 1789, which had provided much of the driving force of the French Revolution. The implication was that they were disregarded by the great powers and excluded from the economic privileges of the developed countries. Plausible though this might sound, the expression Third World actually masked important differences between the members of that group. The coherent Third World politics was not to prove very enduring, and since 1955, many more people have been killed in wars and civil wars within that world than in conflicts external to it. Nevertheless, 10 years after the end of the Second World War, the Bandung meeting forced the great powers to recognize that the weak had power if they could mobilize it. They bore this in mind as they looked for allies in the Cold War and courted votes in the United Nations. By 1960, there were already clear signs that Russian and Chinese interests might diverge as each sought the leadership of the underdeveloped and uncommitted. At first, this emerged bleakly in guise of differing attitudes of the Yugoslavs. It was in the end to be a worldwide contest. One early result was the paradox that, as time passed, Pakistan drew closer to China in spite of a treaty with the United States, and Russia closer to India. When the United States declined to supply arms during the 1965 war with India, Pakistan asked for Chinese help. It got much less than it hoped for, but this was early evidence of a new fluidity that was beginning to mark international affairs in the 1960s. No more than the USSR or China could the United States ignore it. Indeed, the Cold War was to produce an ironic change in the Americans' role in Asia, from being enthusiastic patrons of anti-colonialism and demolishers of their allies' empires. They began sometimes to look rather like their successors, though in the East Asian rather than in the Indian Ocean sphere. where long and unrewarded efforts were made to placate an ungrateful India before 1960. It received more economic aid from the United States than any other country. A very specific example of the new difficulties facing great powers was provided by Indonesia. Its vast sprawl encompassed many peoples, often with widely diverging interests. Although Buddhism had been the first of the world religions to establish itself there, Indonesia had the largest Muslim population under one government in the world, while Buddhists are now a minority. Arab traders had brought Islam to Indonesia's peoples from the 13th century onwards, and more than 4/5 of the Indonesian population is reckoned now to be Muslim. Although traditional animism perhaps matters as much in determining their behavior. Indonesia also has a well entrenched Chinese community, which had in the colonial period enjoyed a preponderant share of wealth and administrative jobs. The departure of the Dutch released communal tensions from the discipline an alien ruler had imposed, just as the usual post-colonial problems. Overpopulation, poverty, inflation began to be felt. In the 1950s, the central government of the new republic was increasingly resented. By 1957, it faced armed rebellion in Sumatra and elsewhere. The time-honored device of distracting opposition with nationalist excitement directed against a continual Dutch presence in the West Guinea did not work anymore. Popular support for President Sukarno was not rebuilt. His government had already moved away from the liberal forms adopted at the birth of the new state, and he leaned more and more on Soviet support. In 1960, Parliament was dismissed, and in 1963, Sukarno was named president for life. Yet the United States, fearing he might turn to China for help, continued to stand by him. American support enabled Sukarno to swallow up, to the irritation of the Dutch, a would-be independent state that had emerged from West New Guinea, West Irian. He then turned on the new Federation of Malaysia, put together in 1957 from fragments of British Southeast Asia. With British help, Malaysia mastered Indonesian attacks on Borneo, Sarawak, and the Malaysian mainland. Although he still enjoyed American patronage, at one moment President Kennedy's brother appeared in London to support his cause. This setback seems to have been the turning point for Sukarno. Exactly what happened is still obscure, but when food shortages and inflation went out of control, a coup was attempted. It failed, behind which, said the leaders of the army, were the communists. It is at least possible that Indonesia was intended by Mao Zedong to play a major part in the export of revolution. The Communist Party, which Sukarno had tried to balance against their politicians, was at one time alleged to be the third largest in the world. Whether or not a communist takeover was intended, however, the economic crisis was exploited by those who feared it was. The popular and traditional Indonesian shadow theatres were for months seasoning the old Hindu epics that were their staple material with plentiful political allusions and overtones of coming change. When the storm broke in 1965, the army stood back ostentatiously while popular massacre removed the communists to whom Sukarno might have turned. Estimates of the number killed vary between 2.25 million, many of them Chinese or of Chinese extraction. Sukarno himself was duly set aside the following year. A solidly anti-communist regime then took power and broke off diplomatic relations with China. They were not to be renewed until 1990. Some of the losers of 1965 were kept in jail, and a few were hanged as evidence of resolute prosecution of the struggle against communism. And no doubt, China's re-emergence. Paradoxically, and for too long incomprehensibly, given Indonesia's problem, American support for Sukarno had reflected the belief that strong, prosperous national states were the best bulwarks against communism. The history of Eastern and Southeastern Asia in the last 40 years can indeed be read so as to offer support for that principle, but it had always to be applied specifically in difficult and complex contexts. In any case, by 1960, the dominant strategic fact east of Singapore was the recreation of Chinese power. South Korea and Japan had successfully resisted communism, but they too benefited from the Chinese Revolution. It gave them leverage against the West, just as East Asians had always helped off Europeans more successfully than the Indian Ocean countries. They showed after 1947 an ability to buttress their independence in both communist and non communist forms, and not to succumb to direct Chinese manipulation. Some have linked this to the deep and many faceted conservatism of societies that had for centuries drawn on Chinese example. In their disciplined, complex social networks, capacity for constructive social effort, disregard for the individual, respect for authority and hierarchy, and deep self awareness as members of civilizations and cultures proudly distinct from the West, the East Asians drew on more than the triumph of the Chinese Revolution. Indeed, that revolution is only comprehensible against a background dominated by something itself immensely varied in its expressions and far from adequately summed up by the cant phrase, Asian values. With the Chinese Revolution's victory and installation in power in 1949, nonetheless, Peking was once more the capital of a formerly reunited China. Some thought this showed that her leaders might again be more aware of pressure from the land frontiers in the north than of the threat from the sea that had faced her for more than a century. However, this may be. The Soviet Union was the first state to recognize the new People's Republic, whose capital was soon officially termed Beijing, closely followed by the United Kingdom, India, and Burma. Given Cold War preoccupations elsewhere and the circumstances of the nationalist collapse, the new China in fact faced no conceivable threat from the outside. Her rulers could concentrate on the long overdue and immensely difficult task of modernization. The nationalists, cooped up in Taiwan, could be disregarded even if, for the moment, they were under American protection and irremovable. When a major threat appeared, as the United Nations forces approached the Yalu River frontier of Manchuria in 1950, the Chinese reaction was strong and immediate. They sent a large army to Korea. But the main preoccupation of China's new rulers was the internal state of the country. Poverty was universal. Disease and malnutrition were widespread. Material and physical construction and reconstruction were overdue. Population pressure on land was as serious as ever, and the moral and ideological void presented by the collapse of the ancient regime over the preceding century had to be filled. The peasants were the starting point. Here, 1949 is not a very significant date. Since the 1920s, land reform had been carried out largely by the peasants themselves in areas the communists dominated. By 1956, China's farms were collectivized in a social transformation of the villages that was set to give control of the new units to their inhabitants, but actually handed them over to the Chinese Communist Party. The overthrow of local village leaders and landlords was often brutal. They must have made up a large number of the 800,000 Chinese, later reported by Mao to have been liquidated in the first 5 years of the People's Republic. Meanwhile, industrialization was also pressed forward, with Soviet help the only source from which China could draw. The model chosen too was the Soviet one. A 5 year plan was announced and launched in 1953 and opened a brief period during which Stalinist ideas dominated Chinese economic management. The new China was soon a major international influence. Yet, her real independence was long masked by the superficial unity of the Communist bloc and its continued exclusion from UNO at the insistence of the United States. A Sino-Soviet treaty in 1950 was interpreted, especially in the United States, as further evidence that China was entering the Cold War. Certainly, the regime was communist and talked revolution and anti-colonialism, and its choices were bound to be confined by the parameters of the Cold War. Yet, in a longer perspective, more traditional concerns now seem evident in Chinese communist policy from the start. At a very early point, there was visible a primary concern to re-establish Chinese power within the area it had always tended to fill up in past centuries. The security of Manchuria by itself is enough to explain Chinese military intervention in Korea, but that peninsula had also long been an area of dispute between Imperial China and Japan. A Chinese occupation of Tibet in 1951 was another incursion into an area that had for centuries been under Chinese suzerainty. But from the start, the most demand made for regaining control of the Chinese periphery was for the eviction of the KMT government from Taiwan, seized in 1895 by the Japanese and only briefly restored in 1945 to control by the mainland. By 1955, the United States government was so deeply committed to support the KMT regime there that the president announced that the United States would protect not merely the island itself but also the smaller islands near the Chinese coast, thought essential to its defense. About this issue and against a psychological background provided by a sense of inexplicable rebuff from a Chinese long patronized by American philanthropy and missionary effort. The views of Americans on Chinese affairs tended to crystallize for over a decade so obsessively that the KMT tail seemed at times to wag the American dog. Conversely, during the 1950s, both India and the USSR supported Beijing over Taiwan, insisting that the matter was one of Chinese internal affairs. It cost them nothing to do so. Sensation was therefore all the greater when China was known to be in armed struggle with both countries. The quarrel with India grew out of the Chinese occupation of Tibet. When the Chinese further tightened their grasps on that country in 1959, Indian policy still seemed basically sympathetic to China. An attempt by the Tibetan exiles to set up a government on Indian soil was stifled, but territorial disputes had already begun and had led to clashes. The Chinese announced that they did not recognize a border with India along lines drawn by a British Tibetan negotiator in 1914 and never formally accepted by any Chinese government. 40 odd years usage was hardly significant in China's millennial historical memory. As a result, there was much heavier fighting in the autumn of 1962 when Nehru demanded a Chinese withdrawal from the disputed zone. The Indians did badly, though fighting ceased at the end of the year on the initiative of the Chinese. Almost at once, early in 1963, a startled world suddenly heard the Soviet Union bitterly denounced by the Chinese communists who allegedly it had helped India. and had, in a hostile gesture, cut off economic and military aid to China 3 years earlier. The second charge suggested complex origins to this quarrel and by no means went to the root of the matter. There were Chinese communists, Mao among them, who remembered all too well what had happened when Chinese interests had been subordinated to the international interest of communism, as interpreted by Moscow in the 1920s. Since that time, there had always been a tension in the leadership of Chinese party between Soviet and native forces. Mao himself represented the latter. Unfortunately, such subtleties were difficult to disentangle because Chinese resentment of Soviet policy had to be presented to the rest of the world in Marxist jargon. Since the new Soviet leadership was engaged at the time in dismantling the Stalin myth, this almost accidentally led the Chinese to sound more Stalinist than Stalin in their public pronouncements, even when they were pursuing non Stalinist policies. In 1963, non Chinese observers should have recalled an even more remote past. Long before the foundation of the CCP, the Chinese Revolution had been a movement of national regeneration. One of its primary aims had been the recovery from the foreigners of China's control over her own destiny. Among these foreigners, the Russians were preeminent. Their record of encroachment upon the Chinese sphere went back to Peter the Great and had continued all through the Tsarist to the Soviet era. A protectorate over Tanutuva had been established in 1914 by the Tsars, but the area was annexed by the Soviet Union in 1944. In 1945, Soviet armies had entered Manchuria and North China and thus reconstituted the Tsarist Far East of 1900. They remained in Pyongyang until 1949 and in Port Arthur until 1955. In Mongolia, they left behind a satellite Mongolian People's Republic set up in the 1920s. With something like 4,000 miles of shared frontier, if Mongolia is included, the potential for friction along its huge length was immense. The Soviet authorities complained of 5,000 Chinese border violations in 1960. An area about one-fifth of the size of Canada was formally a dispute. And by 1969, a year in which there was much fighting and scores were killed, the Chinese were talking of a fascist dictatorship in Moscow and ostentatiously making preparations for war. The Sino-Soviet quarrel that came in the end to entangle the whole communist world was inflamed by Russian tactlessness too. Soviet leaders seem to have been as careless as any Western imperialists of the feelings of Asian allies. One Soviet leader once revealingly remarked that when touring in China, he and other Russians used to laugh at their primitive forms of organization. The withdrawal of the Soviet economic and technical help in 1960 had been a grave affront and one all the more wounding because of the moment at which it came, when China faced the first major domestic crisis of the new regime, in what were officially described as natural disasters caused by flooding. Mao Zedong's personal experience must have counted for much in making this crisis. Although his main intellectual formation had been Marxist, and although he found its categories helpful in explaining his country's predicament, he appears always to have diluted them with pragmatism. Mao was a ruthless power seeker. His judgment of political possibilities appears to have faltered only in the years of success, when megalomania, vanity, and eventually age took their toll. Even as a young man, he had advocated a Marxist Marxism, rejecting Soviet dogma that had cost the CCP dear. The basis of Mao's worldview seems to have been a vision of society and politics as an arena of contending forces in which human willpower and brute force could be deployed to bring about morally desirable and creative change, defined, of course, by an all knowing leader. His relations with his party had not always been untroubled, but his policy towards the peasantry provided a way ahead for it after disaster had overtaken urban communism. After a contemporary setback in the early 1930s, he was from about 1935 virtually supreme within the party. Rural influences predominated. A new wave also seemed to be open for Mao to sway international events. The notion of a protracted revolutionary war, waged from the countryside and carried into the towns, looking promising in other parts of the world where orthodox Marxist belief that industrial development was needed to create a revolutionary proletariat did not look persuasive.